Before they became emperors and queens, they were simply family. The Habsburgs, Europe's most infamous royal dynasty, built an empire not with swords, but with wedding rings. They wove their influence across continents, from Spain to Austria, all while a hidden weakness was unraveling them from within. Their strategy? Marry within the family, again and again. As generations passed, their signature jawlines protruded, their bodies grew weaker, and their minds sometimes faltered. Yet, the lavish ceremonies continued and the alliances were sealed. Behind the gilded halls and flattering portraits, children grew up isolated, and heirs buckled under impossible expectations. This is the story of how a family's obsession with preserving power through blood ultimately became the very thing that consumed it, leaving a legacy that shaped our in the quiet, logical courts of old Europe, where bloodlines were more important than love. The Habsburgs held a powerful belief. Their blood wasn't just noble, it was necessary. It was the very glue holding the continent together. To let it mix with others felt like a risk, almost a sin. So, they turned inward, repeating the marital patterns that had built their empire. A daughter born in Vienna was promised to a cousin in Madrid before she could even speak. A niece in Prague was quietly groomed to marry an uncle she barely knew. These unions were grand spectacles of music, gold, and prayer, while the genetic consequences were pushed aside, a problem for a distant, unseen future. And when the children arrived, often frail, slow, or strange, no one dared connect the dots. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the world was awakening to science. Anatomy was being mapped, diseases studied, but royalty remained exempt from this harsh clarity. Kings were chosen by God, and God's choices were not to be questioned. The Habsburgs leaned heavily on this divine right. When a prince struggled to read, tutors blamed laziness. When a princess suffered from seizures, physicians pointed to vapors or the mysterious frailties of women. When an emperor sank into a depression so deep he could barely leave his bed, courtiers simply called it melancholy, a fashionable affliction for sensitive souls. It could be anything but inheritance. Life inside the imperial palaces adapted to this weakness. Meals were softened for weak jaws, schedules were slowed, and major decisions were perpetually delayed. Power began to flow around the ruler rather than through them. Like a river navigating a fallen tree, the dynasty learned how to function while being chronically ill. This was most obvious in Vienna, where the Austrian Habsburgs perfected the art of ceremonial rule. Emperors appeared rarely, spoke in carefully measured tones, and relied on layers of advisors to interpret their will and run the empire. From the outside, it all looked stable, ancient, dignified, immovable. But inside, it was dangerously brittle. The marriages continued with almost mathematical precision. Royal genealogists traced bloodlines with obsessive care, not to avoid repetition, but to ensure it. The family tree stopped branching out. It began to spiral inward, uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin. Again and again, each union tightened the genetic circle, dramatically increasing the chances that rare, recessive traits would emerge and compound. This led to weak immune systems, infertility, cognitive impairments, emotional instability, and severe facial deformities. The famous Habsburg jaw became more than just a family trait. It was a warning written directly into their bones. Yet, the official portraits told a different story. Court artists were masters of flattery. They exaggerated foreheads to suggest intelligence, softened protruding chins, and painted a look of sharp awareness into vacant eyes. These idealized images traveled across Europe, projecting an illusion of strength where little existed. Foreign courts saw exactly what the Habsburgs wanted them to see. The truth, however, stayed behind the palace walls, a closely guarded family secret. By the 18th century, the whispers grew louder. The Enlightenment was dawning, and thinkers began to question the very idea of monarchy, challenging the belief that certain families were inherently fit to rule. The Habsburgs responded not with reform, but with stubborn continuity. They had survived religious wars, peasant revolts, and foreign invasions. Surely, they thought, they could survive this new wave of doubt. But history was now moving faster than their bloodlines could. As nationalism surged, loyalty to a dynasty began to fade. People no longer saw themselves as children of an emperor, but as Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, and Italians. The Habsburg rulers, insulated by tradition and weakened by inheritance, struggled to comprehend this monumental shift. Their world had always been inherited. Now, it demanded adaptation. Inside the palaces, the symptoms worsened. Mental illness became harder to conceal. Some rulers were consumed by anxiety, others by paranoia, while some were simply absent, lost in their own worlds. Decisions that required boldness were met with hesitation and silence. The empire still moved, but it did so slowly, as if wading through deep water. Medicine was advancing, but the damage was already encoded in their DNA. Doctors prescribed rest, fresh air, and mineral baths, treatments that soothed symptoms but could never address the root cause. None could prescribe what they truly needed: new blood. And still, the marriages continued. To stop would be to admit failure, not just a personal failure, but a dynastic sin. The Habsburgs had built their entire identity on continuity. Breaking the cycle meant questioning centuries of policy, belief, and sacrifice. It was far easier to just continue and hope. Hope became a ritual. Across the empire, prayers were offered for healthy heirs. Holy relics were kissed. Pilgrimages were funded. Faith was tasked with correcting what flawed strategy had broken. Occasionally, a child was born strong, and these moments were celebrated with an almost desperate joy, seen as proof that the system still worked. But even these children carried the same concentrated inheritance, the same genetic risks ticking away quietly in their cells. Time was not on their side. By the 19th century, the Habsburg Empire felt like a grand museum pretending to be a government. Its palaces were full, its ceremonies immaculate, its rulers polite and perpetually tired. The world outside was thrumming with steam engines, new industries, and revolutionary ideologies. Inside, the clock seemed to tick more slowly. When Franz Joseph ascended the throne, he embodied the dynasty's final contradiction. He was personally disciplined, dutiful, and outwardly stable, ruling for decades while his private life was hollowed out by tragedy. His son died in a suicide pact. His beloved wife was assassinated. His nephew's scandalous death seemed to reek of despair. The dynasty persisted, but joy did not. The genetic decay was no longer the only threat. Political stagnation, ethnic tensions, and the pressures of modern warfare were closing in from all sides. The empire survived not through strength, but through sheer inertia. Then came the war that demanded everything the Habsburgs no longer possessed: clarity, adaptability, and resilience. World War I shattered the illusion of permanence. Armies collapsed, borders dissolved, and subjects turned away for good. When the empire finally fell, it did so quietly, almost politely, as if it was relieved to finally stop pretending. There was no grand execution, no dramatic final stand, just abdication and exile. The Habsburg dynasty, which once stretched across continents, was reduced to memory and portraiture. What remains is not just a cautionary tale about inbreeding, but a story about rigidity. It is the story of a family so committed to preserving itself that it forgot how to survive. A dynasty that mistook repetition for stability and purity for strength. They ruled Europe for centuries, shaping its borders, its wars, and its culture. And in the end, they were undone not by their enemies, but by their own devastating refusal to change. Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time. For centuries, marriage was the language of power for the Habsburgs. Every alliance, every treaty, every inheritance was sealed with a wedding. By the time they realized something was profoundly wrong with this system, they no longer knew how to imagine an alternative. To abandon it would be like learning a new language late in life, and dynasties, like old men, rarely learn quickly. Inside the private apartments of the court, Habsburg children grew up under a peculiar kind of pressure. They were loved, but their bodies were also inspected with political anxiety. Every cough was noted, every delay observed, every odd behavior quietly recorded and explained away. The entire household adapted itself around. Weakness, fragility was normalized, and excellence was quietly abandoned. A prince who struggled to read was praised for his piety. A princess prone to illness was admired for her gentleness. What couldn't be cured was simply rebranded as a virtue. The emotional cost of this went unspoken. Children sensed they were different long before anyone said it aloud. They saw conversations pause when they entered a room and noticed how expectations softened around them. They learned that disappointment was dangerous and that failure must be disguised as destiny. Many grew inward, finding comfort in silence, routine, and ritual. Others developed obsession schedules, symbols, rules that made the world predictable when their own bodies were not. These traits, passed quietly from one generation to the next, shaped the psychology of the dynasty just as much as its genetics. To compensate, the Habsburg court became a fortress of control. Ceremonies followed exact sequences. Meals were eaten at precise times. Clothing signaled rank, down to the smallest detail. In a family where biology was unreliable, order became sacred. Deviation felt dangerous. This rigidity extended to how they governed. Emperors hesitated to experiment or reform. Laws accumulated rather than evolved. Problems were managed, not solved. Everything was designed to last, even when it no longer worked. Outsiders noticed the stagnation. Foreign diplomats wrote of a court frozen in time, elegant but exhausted. They described rulers who listened carefully but acted slowly, who preferred consensus over decisiveness and tradition over innovation. In an age that increasingly rewarded speed and adaptability, the Habsburgs remained cautious and ceremonial. Their bodies mirrored their politics. As science advanced, a few physicians began to suspect what could not be spoken. Medical records from the 18th and 19th centuries use careful phrasing, referring to constitutional weakness, family predisposition, and hereditary sensitivity. No one used the word inbreeding, but everyone circled around it. Still, no corrective action was taken. The solution was obvious, but also unthinkable. To introduce new blood meant marrying outside the tight web of royal houses that defined European legitimacy. It meant risking alliances, trusting strangers, and admitting the old way had failed. The Habsburgs chose familiarity over health. By the time modern genetics could have explained their condition, the dynasty was already past its peak. The great marriages no longer brought new lands. The empire no longer expanded. What remained was maintenance, holding together a mosaic of peoples who increasingly questioned why they were ruled by a family that seemed so distant, tired, and out of touch. The rulers sensed this disconnection but struggled to respond. Their upbringing had prepared them to inherit, not to persuade. Authority had always flowed from blood, not popularity. When subjects demanded reform, the dynasty answered with patience and protocol. But the world did not wait. Nationalist movements cut across the empire like cracks in old stone. Languages once suppressed demanded recognition. Regions once governed from Vienna wanted autonomy. Each demand required flexibility, negotiation, and compromise, three things the Habsburg system resisted. Yet, even as the empire strained, the family continued its rituals. Births were announced, deaths were mourned, and weddings were staged with careful grandeur. The dynasty presented continuity as stability, hoping no one would notice the difference. Decline has a rhythm. It's slow enough to ignore but fast enough to be irreversible. By the early 20th century, the Habsburg Empire depended less on loyalty than on habit. People obeyed because they always had, not because they believed. The rulers ruled because they always had, not because they inspired. When the assassination at Sarajevo ignited Europe, the Habsburg leadership responded as it always did, deliberately, cautiously, bound by procedure. The world, meanwhile, exploded into motion. War demanded rapid decisions and brutal clarity. The old empire offered committees, memoranda, and delay. Its armies fought bravely, but its leadership was overwhelmed by the scale and speed of modern conflict. As defeats mounted and shortages spread, the illusion of inevitability shattered. Subjects no longer saw the Habsburgs as eternal. They saw them as obsolete. When the empire finally collapsed, it revealed something quietly profound. For centuries, the Habsburgs believed they were preserving Europe by preserving themselves. In reality, they had been preserving a system that no longer fit the world it ruled. Their downfall wasn't dramatic because it was long overdue. The palaces emptied, titles lost their meaning. Former emperors became private citizens, wandering through exile with memories instead of authority. The bloodline survived, but the dynasty did not. What lingers is the silence they left behind. History rarely looks in the private rooms, but that's where the real cost of being a Habsburg was paid. It was paid in small, daily humiliations. A prince struggling to hold a spoon steady, a princess fainting during mass, an heir who could recite prayers flawlessly but couldn't grasp numbers, strategy, or consequence. These moments were never recorded in the official chronicles. They lived instead in the margins of letters, in physicians' notes written with deliberate vagueness, and in the worried glances exchanged by servants trained to say nothing. The court learned to lower its expectations without ever admitting it had done so. For the children born into this dynasty, the knowledge of duty arrived long before self-understanding. They were taught who they were before they ever discovered what they could do. Their lives were planned in advance, and when their bodies or minds resisted those plans, the plans did not change. The children did. Some withdrew into silence, others developed a rigid obedience, clinging to rules because rules don't judge. Emotional expression was discouraged. Unpredictability felt dangerous. In a family already haunted by fragility, a strong emotion was treated like just another illness. This emotional restraint shaped generations of rulers who appeared calm, dignified, and distant. But beneath that placid surface, anxiety simmered. Many lived with the constant awareness that they were being evaluated not for competence, but for adequacy. Were they adequate enough to marry, adequate enough to produce an heir, adequate enough to keep the massive machine of empire running? Love was a secondary concern, if it was a concern at all. Habsburg marriages, even by royal standards, were notably cold. Partners were selected for bloodline compatibility and political utility, not affection. For individuals already isolated by their upbringing, these unions often deepened loneliness rather than relieving it. The letters exchanged between spouses are polite, formal, and sparse. Intimacy is implied, never described. Children were expected, not longed for. The failure to produce heirs was treated as a dynastic tragedy, but rarely as personal grief. It was a malfunction, not a heartbreak. The pressure to reproduce weighed heavily on the women of the dynasty. Many entered marriage young, their bodies already weakened by inherited conditions. Pregnancies were frequent and dangerous. Miscarriages were common. Infant mortality was quietly accepted. When children did survive, the overwhelming feeling was relief, which often overshadowed any concern for their quality of life. Physicians attempted to manage what they could not fix. Diets were adjusted. Physical activity was limited. Rest was prescribed excessively. This approach protected weakness rather than challenging it, reinforcing fragility instead of countering it. The court became a bubble where natural selection no longer applied. But outside that bubble, the world was hardening. The 18th and 19th centuries rewarded industrial capacity, administrative efficiency, and popular legitimacy. States that adapted thrived. Those that did not fell behind. The Habsburg Empire survived because it was large, not because it was agile. Its rulers presided over railways they barely understood, factories they did not visit, and populations they could not fully relate to. Many spoke multiple languages fluently, yet struggled to grasp the political reality unfolding right beneath them. Their education had emphasized continuity, not disruption, and so, disruption caught them completely unprepared. As revolutionary ideas spread across Europe, the dynasty relied on a mixture of repression and compromise, neither of which was decisive enough to restore authority or flexible enough to transform it. Each crisis was patched over, not resolved. Meanwhile, the genetic issues that had haunted the family for centuries continued to surface. Infertility limited the options for succession. Mental illness complicated leadership. Physical weakness reduced their public presence. The image of the monarchy grew abstract, more symbolic than personal. By the time modern observers began analyzing the Habsburg lineage with scientific tools, the results were stark. Genealogical studies revealed levels of inbreeding that far exceeded even other royal houses. In some cases, individuals had genetic profiles equivalent to the offspring of siblings. The consequences were written plainly in history, if one only knew how to read them. But for those living inside the dynasty, that recognition came far too late. When World War I ended and the empire dissolved, the former Habsburg royals faced a world that no longer cared about their blood. Their titles offered no protection. Their lineage carried no authority. The rituals that had defined their entire existence were suddenly meaningless. Many struggled to adapt. Some attempted quiet civilian lives, clinging to the discipline and routine they knew. Others just drifted, unmoored by their loss of purpose. The psychological shock of becoming irrelevant was profound for a family raised to believe its very existence was necessary for the world. The dynasty had not prepared its members for a world without them. And yet, in this fall from power, there was an unexpected clarity. Stripped of all ceremony, the Habsburg story becomes deeply human. It reveals individuals shaped by forces they did not choose, born into a system that demanded continuity at the expense of health, adaptability, and emotional freedom. Their tragedy was not cruelty, but caution. They believed too deeply in inheritance. They trusted tradition more than evidence. They preserved the form of their power long after its function had failed. In the end, the Habsburgs serve as a quiet reminder that power, like blood, must circulate to remain alive. When it is sealed off, protected from change, it begins to decay slowly, politely, and almost invisibly. Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. Have you ever looked at a royal portrait and felt like you've seen that face before? For one of Europe's most powerful families, this wasn't just a coincidence. And the haunting lesson they left behind, written not in history books, but in their own blood. But this isn't just any family tree. For generations, they married cousins, nieces, and uncles, creating relationships so close that the line between ancestor and descendant blurred into a statistical certainty. The famous Habsburg jaw, a prominent lower jaw that made it difficult to speak or eat, the developmental delays that plagued their children, the struggles with infertility. They were the predictable, inevitable consequences of their own choices. But to just label the Habsburgs as a medical case study would be missing the bigger picture. Their true legacy isn't just in their DNA. It's in the system. They created a system that not only encouraged these choices, but rewarded them. For centuries, Europe operated on a simple assumption: stability comes from sameness. Power is safest when it's kept within a tiny, exclusive circle. Republics rose from the ashes of monarchies. Constitutions and laws replaced bloodlines as the source of authority. Leadership, at least in theory, became something you had to earn, not just inherit. But the ghosts of the past don't just vanish. The magnificent palaces didn't disappear. They became museums. Suddenly, ordinary people, tourists, could walk through the grand halls that were once forbidden territory. Unsettling. Visitors couldn't help but notice it: the jaw, the eyes, the constant, unnerving repetition from one generation to the next. What was once a private family matter became a public spectacle. Historians began to look at the Habsburg centuries in a new light. Their legendary endurance was no longer just admired, it was questioned. And in that questioning, the dynasty transformed from an ideal to be emulated into a powerful warning. This story hits so hard because it's not just about kings and queens. It echoes in any system, big or small, that values preservation over adaptation, that mistakes purity for strength, that clings to tradition even when it contradicts the truth. The Habsburgs were an extreme case, for sure, but they weren't unique. They just managed to hang on long enough for all the consequences to pile up, generation after generation. Modern science has only confirmed what history has always suggested: diversity isn't a threat to strength, it's the very foundation of it. The Habsburgs borrowed for centuries, and eventually, the debt came due. They were doing it out of pure habit. The strategy had become a hollow ritual, followed with reverence long after its purpose had faded away. For centuries, a single family held Europe in its grip, not through conquest, but through marriage and stubborn ritual. This is the story of the Habsburgs, a dynasty that didn't fall in a blaze of glory, but simply faded away, like an old photograph left in the sun. Their final years were less about grand action and more about sheer endurance. Inside their opulent palaces, courtiers and servants witnessed the same rituals, day after day, decade after decade. Breakfast was served at the exact same hour. The emperor's chair never moved an inch from its designated spot. Decrees were written, filed, and often forgotten, as if the empire itself could be preserved through habit alone. This was a world where weakness was protected and fragility was enshrined. Generation after generation believed they could outlast misfortune, outlast disease, and even outlast the slow decay that seemed embedded in their own bloodline. The family persisted, not through vitality or vision, but through a stubborn, almost mechanical repetition of the past. Take Emperor Franz Joseph. His long reign became a testament to survival, not triumph. He carried the weight of centuries in his posture, in the careful, precise way he moved. His personal life was marked by endless grief. He outlived his own son, mourned his assassinated wife, and faced revolutions he could neither fully prevent nor truly control. He was the living embodiment of a dynasty that simply refused to die, even as its body and mind grew weaker with every passing year. But outside the palace walls, the world was changing at a dizzying pace. Industrialization was transforming cities overnight. New technologies were changing the face of warfare, and radical political ideologies were challenging the very idea of monarchy. The Habsburgs had once commanded loyalty through divine right and blood. Now, they relied on hollow ceremony and entrenched habit. The diverse peoples of their vast empire, once quiet provinces, began to demand recognition, independence, and justice. The empire was a tapestry of different cultures and languages, but its rulers were increasingly unable to bridge the divides. When the First World War erupted, the Habsburg Empire was already a house of cards. Its leaders acted with the same paralyzing caution they always had, deliberating endlessly over matters that demanded immediate, decisive action. Their armies fought bravely, but the leadership, weakened by centuries of protected frailty, faltered. Borders dissolved, alliances crumbled. The entire dynastic system, once the cornerstone of European power, revealed itself to be brittle and obsolete. And then, it was over. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. The emperor abdicated, the palaces emptied, the crowns were set aside. The family that had married its way into ruling a continent became ordinary citizens overnight. There was no great battle, no revolution storming the gates. The world simply found that it no longer required the Habsburgs in exile. They lived in a strange limbo. They were trained for absolute authority, but were stripped of all power. Routine became their survival mechanism. Ritual became their comfort. Memory replaced command, and in that quiet withdrawal, the dynasty's most intimate truth was revealed. Their survival had never really been about strength. It had always been about endurance, about patience, and about the stubborn repetition of habit. Today, historians study the Habsburgs with fascination, tracing the lines where power, heredity, and human limitation meet. We analyze their portraits, their letters, their medical records, piecing together lives lived under unimaginable pressure. We see the famous Habsburg jaw, a physical trait passed down through generations of strategic inbreeding. We see the mental vulnerabilities, the quiet grief hidden behind stiff court etiquette. We see children who were loved but never free, and rulers who bore responsibilities they could not possibly manage. The story of the Habsburgs is both a cautionary tale and a profoundly human story. It reminds us that systems can outlast the people who operate them, that authority can linger long after wisdom has faded. Their decline wasn't violent or abrupt, it was a quiet, cumulative decay, a slow suffocation beneath the crushing weight of their own inheritance and expectations. Today, the dynasty persists only in echoes. In the grand palace halls now walked by tourists, in the famous portraits that still bear that familiar jaw and those melancholic eyes, in the genealogical charts that trace a family that once commanded Europe. The lesson is subtle, but it's unavoidable. When power is insulated from the real world, when change is resisted at all costs. Even as the Habsburgs faded from the political stage, their ghost lingered in the most unexpected ways. Across Europe, streets still carried the names of emperors long gone. Grand palaces stood silent, filled with ornate furniture, priceless paintings, and the echoes of conversations from centuries past. The world they once commanded had moved on, but the traces of their authority continued to shape nations, borders, and identities for generations. Within the family itself, life found a new, unfamiliar rhythm. Freed from the immense pressures of empire, its members were forced to confront realities they had never been trained for. Suddenly, they needed to work, to negotiate their own way, to make choices without the safety net of inherited power. For many, this adjustment was profoundly unsettling. After centuries of ritual, ceremony, and tightly controlled lives, they were simply unprepared for the ordinary. The sense of divine purpose that had guided their every action had vanished, leaving behind only reflection, memory, and a persistent, aching awareness of all that had been lost. Despite this decline, the world's fascination with the dynasty only grew. Scholars, artists, and writers began to explore the Habsburg story not just as history, but as a powerful allegory. Their lives were dissected, revealing troubling patterns of inbreeding, mental fragility, and the deep psychological scars of long-term isolation. Every arranged marriage, every solemn portrait, every private diary entry became a clue in a grand puzzle. How could a single family rule for centuries, yet remain so trapped by its own traditions? It became clear that the Habsburgs weren't just victims of circumstance. They were victims of their own meticulously crafted system. They had preserved their power, but at the cost of adaptability. They had maintained their sacred traditions, but at the cost of their own health. In perfecting the art of dynastic survival, they had systematically weakened the very bodies and minds required to wield that power effectively. Their empire had endured far longer than it probably should have, sustained by sheer inertia, rigid ritual, and the careful management of appearances. And yet, if you look closely at the private tragedies of their lives, you can find a strange and haunting beauty. There was the prince who could barely walk, but who learned to read poetry aloud, his voice trembling but filled with pride. There was the princess, chronically ill from birth, who developed a wit so sharp it could charm and disarm the most hardened diplomats. The family's endurance, though deeply flawed, revealed a quiet resilience in the face of limitations imposed by blood and circumstance. Their humanity, so often obscured by centuries of pomp and ceremony, was finally visible in these small moments of courage and dignity. The fall of the Habsburgs also forced Europe to rethink the very idea of monarchy. For centuries, royal bloodlines were seen as infallible, their continuity a guarantee of stability. The devastating physical and mental consequences of the Habsburgs' insularity shattered this illusion for good. Historians began to see that heredity, adaptability, and the ability to evolve were just as crucial to rulership as grand alliances and battlefield victories. The lessons from their decline reached far beyond the palace walls, influencing ideas about governance, society, and even modern genetics. As the 20th century unfolded, Habsburg descendants gradually integrated into the wider world. They married outside of noble circles, pursued professions, and often struggled to reconcile their famous ancestry with the anonymity of a normal life. Yet the immense weight of their history never fully disappeared. The letters, diaries, and artifacts they left behind kept the past alive, serving as constant reminders of the dynasty's extraordinary longevity and its ultimate, tragic fragility. What remains so compelling about the Habsburgs is this constant interplay of immense power and profound vulnerability. They wielded authority across continents, yet their greatest threats always came from within, from inherited weakness, from the consequences of inbreeding, and from the inflexible habits of centuries. They managed to survive external disasters they could control, but were ultimately undone by the quiet, unstoppable forces of biology and the slow, grinding pressures of history. Their story is both a cautionary tale and a tragedy, a meditation on the immense human cost of preserving power above all else. Even today, the Habsburg legacy captivates us because it is a story of extremes, of ambition restrained by fragility, of continuity pursued at the expense of adaptation, of a family whose influence shaped a continent even as its own members struggled to simply survive. It reminds us that history isn't just written in battles and treaties, it's also written in quiet chambers, in the endless repetition of rituals, and in the intimate, personal costs of an inherited destiny. Perhaps the dynasty's final lesson is its most subtle. The longevity of a rule does not equal wisdom, and mere survival does not equal strength. Even the most powerful houses, insulated by wealth and revered for generations, are subject to the quiet, unrelenting forces of biology, circumstance, and time. And in that simple truth, the Habsburgs endure. Inside the silent halls of European palaces, the human cost of preserving a dynasty became painfully clear. For the Habsburgs, one of the most powerful royal houses in history, portraits could conceal nothing from those who lived with the consequences every day. Princes and princesses carried the weight of expectation, ritual, and a dangerous genetic inheritance in ways outsiders could never truly comprehend. From a young age, they learned a harsh lesson. Their bodies were not fully their own. Every illness, every weakness, every perceived oddity was interpreted through the lens of dynastic duty. Imagine a young archduke, his legs weak from generations of close family marriage, struggling just to walk. Yet, in public ceremonies, he was required to appear strong and confident. He learned to mask the tremors in his hands behind a straight posture, to force a smile when the court demanded it, and to memorize long speeches and prayers his mind struggled to retain. For him, each public gesture was an act of survival as much as it was an act of obedience. The princesses faced a different, yet equally crushing, form of isolation. Often confined to their chambers, for their own safety and health, they lived under constant supervision. Chronic illness, pervasive fatigue, and delicate constitutions were common. Their world was small, populated by tutors, nurses, and governesses who shaped not only their education, but also their behavior and even their emotions. For some, the solace of books and music offered a precious escape. For others, the relentless monotony of their secluded lives bred a quiet despair. In this world, genuine love was a rarity, and true freedom was even rarer. Their marriages were not unions of the heart, but strategic alliances designed to continue the system. They were pawns in a grand political game, expected to endure, produce heirs, and maintain an unwavering dignity, no matter the personal cost. Unsurprisingly, mental fragility was a pervasive, silent companion. The private diaries and letters of the time offer heartbreaking glimpses into widespread anxiety, deep depression, and obsessive behaviors. Some heirs developed compulsive routines, a desperate attempt to impose some semblance of order on bodies and minds that felt inherently unstable. Others sought refuge in intense spirituality, retreating into prayer and ritual to cope with the immense pressures of their inheritance. While intellectual curiosity wasn't absent, it was always tempered by extreme caution. In the high-stakes world of the court, a mistake could have devastating consequences, not just for the individual, but for the very continuity of the dynasty. Medical practitioners of the era were aware of the hereditary issues plaguing the family, but they had no real means to correct them. Their treatments were often experimental, sometimes bordering on superstition. They adjusted diets, prescribed therapeutic baths, and recommended specific exercises. But these measures only addressed the symptoms, never the root cause. The family's fragility persisted, a quiet undercurrent to the grand theater of the court. Deformities, developmental delays, and chronic illnesses were managed with care, concealed from the public eye, and woven into the fabric of daily life. Yet, even amidst widespread illness and limitation, the Habsburgs were expected to perform their rituals of power flawlessly. Grand ceremonies, formal audiences, strategic marriages, and complex diplomatic interactions were never suspended for health or incapacity. If an heir was unable to meet these demands, advisors, tutors, and regents would quietly step in, ensuring that the all-important appearance of strength and stability was maintained. The dynasty's endurance depended on upholding this illusion, even as the reality of its members' health weakened. But within this rigid structure, there were fleeting moments of human tenderness, brief, precious glimpses of life outside the crushing weight of obligation. A child finding deep comfort in playing music, a sibling tenderly caring for another during a bout of illness, or a private letter expressing profound longing or sorrow. These small acts of humanity persisted, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit against a backdrop of endless ritual and expectation. However, even these moments were framed by the larger narrative of duty. The survival of the self was always secondary to the survival of the house. As Europe transformed around them and external threats multiplied, the internal pressures on the Habsburgs remained constant. They were heirs to centuries of insularity, a legacy that meant each generation inherited not only immense power, but also profound fragility, overwhelming expectation, and the invisible, cumulative consequences of repeated intermarriage. The story of their endurance is a paradox. The dynasty persisted despite its inherent weakness, yet that very weakness ultimately defined its decline. By looking closely at the intimate, personal experiences of these individuals, the Habsburg story transcends mere politics and empire. It becomes a powerful meditation on inheritance, duty, and the absolute limits of human endurance. Power, longevity, and ceremony, it turns out, could not fully shield them from the realities of biology or circumstance. The dynasty's private life, with its quiet suffering, its remarkable perseverance, and its occasional, hard-won moments of joy, illuminates a deeply human dimension of history that official records and grand portraits often overlook. It's a reminder that behind every crown and every throne, there are individuals grappling with the burden. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, a strange paradox was unfolding in the heart of Europe. The Habsburg Empire stretched wider than ever, a vast mosaic of peoples and lands. Yet for the ruling family, the world was shrinking. While railways, telegraphs, and booming industrial cities were rewriting the map of the continent. The Habsburg dynasty remained locked in the gilded cage of its past, anchored in centuries-old habits and rituals. The palace walls, once a symbol of immense power, were now both a sanctuary and a prison. Inside these walls, life moved to the inherited rhythms of ceremony and tradition. Every bow, every procession, every courtly decree was a performance meant to project stability. But outside, the world was demanding something new: adaptation, decisiveness, and vision. The very idea of monarchy, of ruling by divine right and ancient lineage, was being challenged by fierce new forces: nationalism, industrial unrest, and political movements that spoke for the people, not the crown. For the Habsburgs, this was an unprecedented strain. They were trained to preserve, not to innovate. Their power had long been exercised indirectly, filtered through layers of advisors and a sprawling bureaucracy. Every decision was a slow, deliberate process, weighed down by caution, consultation, and ceremony. This was a system designed for a static world, but now it was a fatal flaw. Action was slowed to a crawl at the very moment speed was essential for survival. Emperor Franz Joseph, the longest reigning of them all, was the living embodiment of this tension. He was a man of immense personal discipline, famously dutiful, waking before dawn to pore over state papers. For decades, he navigated one political crisis after another with a steady hand and meticulous attention to detail. But the sheer pressure of holding together an empire fracturing along ethnic, linguistic, and cultural lines took a relentless toll. Grief became a constant companion, compounding the immense burden of rule. His beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, was assassinated. His only son and heir, Crown Prince Rudolph, died in a tragic suicide pact. Each personal loss seemed to echo the deeper, more insidious fragility woven into the family's very DNA, a legacy of inbreeding that left them vulnerable to both physical and psychological ailments. Then came the summer of 1914. The outbreak of the First World War ripped away the last veneer of stability and exposed all the vulnerabilities that had been quietly accumulating for generations. The empire's armies, once the terror of Europe, were stretched thin, its leadership paralyzed by indecision. Strategies were debated and delayed. Heirs and ministers, steeped in a culture of caution, were simply unable to act with the decisiveness the war demanded. The inherited weaknesses of the dynasty, the physical frailties, the psychological strains, the rigid adherence to tradition collided with the structural inflexibility of the empire. The Habsburgs were simply not equipped to fight a modern, total war. They couldn't respond to a world that no longer moved in measured, ceremonial steps or followed the old rules of diplomacy. And yet, even as the world burned, the rituals continued. Inside the Hofburg Palace, the grand ceremonies, the diplomatic correspondence, the courtly appearances, it all went on. A desperate performance of continuity. It was a stark and surreal contrast. Inside the palace, an illusion of control and precision. Outside, chaos and total disintegration. For the Habsburgs, performance had become survival. They maintained their carefully preserved image, hoping the world wouldn't notice the empire was crumbling around them. But by 1918, the illusion could no longer be sustained. The end came not with a bang, but with a quiet, inexorable unraveling. One by one, the peoples of the empire simply stopped recognizing the authority of the crown. Regions declared independence, armies disbanded, and soldiers walked home. In the end, the emperor abdicated. There was no violent revolution, no storming of the palace. The crowns and scepters were simply set aside, palaces emptied, centuries of tradition dissolved. In the quiet of resignation, the aftermath was deeply personal. These were people trained from birth to rule, to command, to exist at the center of a vast imperial stage. Now, they had to navigate the bewildering world of ordinary life. The discipline and ritual that had defined their entire existence remained, but suddenly without purpose or an audience. Some embraced anonymity, disappearing into the quiet corners of Europe. Others drifted, haunted by the ghost of their former lives, caught between an inherited authority that meant everything and an actual irrelevance that was absolute. Even in exile, they remained prisoners of their own legacy, the weight of history pressing down on them. The long, slow decline of the Habsburgs offers a powerful lesson. It shows us that endurance is not the same as vitality. A dynasty can survive for centuries through careful marriages, rigid rituals, and bureaucratic management, but that is not enough. It could not withstand the unstoppable force of a modernizing world. Their story is not one of a dramatic, sudden overthrow. It is a story of slow erosion, of fragile bodies and inherited weaknesses. of psychological strain and social rigidity all converging at once. It reveals the ultimate limits of a power that insulates itself from change. History remembers the Habsburgs not for a spectacular collapse, but for their subtle disappearance, a quiet fading into the pages of history. Their grand palaces still stand, their portraits still hang in museums, their legacy still echoes through Central Europe, but the dynasty itself is gone. A quiet reminder that any power, no matter how ancient or enduring, is ultimately vulnerable when it refuses to adapt to the world outside its own walls. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into the past fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories from history. We'll see you next time. The final chapter of the Habsburg story isn't one of epic battles or grand revolutions. Instead, it's a quiet tale of reflection, memory, and the enduring persistence of a legacy. As Europe marched into the modern era, the dynasty gracefully faded from the political stage, but its spirit remained etched into the continent's architecture, its art, and its collective memory. The grand palaces that once housed emperors and empresses became museums, their opulent halls now filled with curious visitors. The portraits that once projected power are now studied by historians, and the elaborate rituals that define their world are examined as relics of a bygone era time, when ceremony was paramount. Descendants of this once mighty family scattered across Europe, blending into the fabric of ordinary life. They married outside of noble circles, pursued professions, and learned to live without the immense weight of inherited authority. For many, this transition was a strange mix of liberation and disorientation. Imagine being trained for centuries to act with precision, deference, and a profound sense of duty, only to find yourself in a modern world that demanded independence, initiative, and adaptation skills that had never been part of their education. The psychological echoes of centuries of insularity and genetic fragility lingered. Reading their diaries and letters, you can feel the quiet struggles of individuals trying to balance their personal desires against the heavy residue of dynastic expectation. Some clung to strict, familiar routines, a small vestige of palace life. Others desperately sought freedom in travel, education, or art, carving out small pockets of autonomy in the long shadow of their heritage. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Habsburgs lies in the powerful lessons their history teaches us. Their story is a stark illustration of the limits of insular power and the inevitable consequences of prioritizing continuity over adaptability. For centuries, the Habsburgs preserved their dynasty through strategic marriages, elaborate rituals, and the meticulous management of their public image. Yet, these very strategies, when taken to their extreme, became the architects of their decline. Biological fragility, immense emotional strain, and political rigidity accumulated quietly, often hidden from the public eye, until the moment the empire itself crumbled. Today, modern historians and scientists have analyzed the family with incredible care. Genetic studies have confirmed the devastating consequences of their prolonged intermarriage, providing a scientific basis for what was once just historical observation. At the same time, political and cultural analysis helps us understand the dynasty's remarkable endurance and its eventual slide into irrelevance. When you bring these perspectives together, a complex and fascinating portrait emerges. A family that ruled much of Europe for centuries, shaping its politics and influencing its culture, yet was simultaneously trapped by the very systems that had enabled its rise to power. What remains is a story that is both a cautionary tale and a deeply human one. The Habsburgs are a powerful reminder that no power is immortal. Authority can be inherited, passed down through generations, but wisdom, adaptability, and resilience, these are qualities that must be cultivated. Systems that wall themselves off from change may survive longer than anyone expects, but they will eventually have to confront the unyielding realities of biology, circumstance, and societal transformation. But their story is also incredibly intimate. If you look beyond the crowns, the treaties, and the grand politics, you find something much more relatable. It's a story about children growing up under extraordinary pressures, about rulers navigating the impossible expectations of their legacy, and about the profound emotional and physical cost of a family obsessed with its own continuity. These human experiences add a rich texture to history, reminding us that behind the magnificent facade of empire lies the fragile, often difficult reality of life lived in service to ideals, tradition, and sheer survival. The Habsburg dynasty may no longer wield political power, but its echoes resonate to this day. You can see it in the art and architecture that grace European cities. You can trace it in the intricate genealogical charts that map their sprawling family tree, and you can feel it in the lingering, fascination of historians and storytellers. The Habsburgs continue to teach us. Their rise and fall, their incredible endurance and their inherent fragility serve as a powerful meditation on the limits of inheritance, the high cost of insularity, and the delicate, timeless interplay between power and humanity. And so, the story of the Habsburg dynasty comes to its quiet, unassuming conclusion. It didn't end with a thunderous battle or a fiery revolution, but with the slow, relentless ticking of the clock, the inexorable passage of time. This was the dynasty that had married Europe into a tightly woven web of alliances, a family that ruled with absolute precision, unyielding ritual, and breathtaking ceremony. But one by one, crowns were set aside, palaces emptied, and titles that once commanded armies became little more than historical artifacts. Yet, behind the gilded walls and beneath the weight of those crowns, the human story persisted. The princes and princesses, the emperors and archdukes, they all lived, loved, and suffered. They experienced profound isolation, a constant battle with fragile health, and the crushing expectation to continue the line, no matter the cost. Each life was a paradox, a life of immense privilege and yet a life of confinement. They carried unimaginable responsibility, yet were often physically and emotionally vulnerable. In their station, they were extraordinary, but in their human fragility, they were painfully ordinary. As Europe itself moved on, the deep imprint of the Habsburgs remained etched into its very soul. The grand cities, the stunning architecture, and the vibrant cultures all carried traces of their centuries-long influence. The borders they drew, the treaties they signed, and the courts they established continued to shape nations long after the dynasty lost its authority. Their legacy became a fascinating lens through which historians, scientists, and storytellers could examine the intricate dance between power, heredity, and human limitation. If there's one lesson the Habsburgs teach us, it's one that transcends time. Endurance alone does not guarantee survival. Repetition without adaptation, clinging to tradition for tradition's sake, can be just as destructive as any war or revolution. The Habsburgs endured for centuries by perfecting and preserving their form, but form alone could not sustain their substance. Their story is a powerful reminder that any power insulated from reality, no matter how vast or absolute, is ultimately vulnerable to quiet, cumulative forces biological, psychological, and societal. Even now, the Habsburgs live on in echoes. You see them in the portraits hanging in museums, with those familiar, elongated features and the famous Habsburg jaw. You feel them in the palaces whose long, silent corridors seem to whisper their history. You can trace them in genealogical charts, following the looping, intricate lines of inheritance from one generation to the next. And of course, you hear them in the stories we continue to tell about them. They endure not as rulers, but as a meditation on the fragile, delicate balance between ambition, tradition, and our shared humanity. And perhaps, in the end, that is the most haunting and powerful truth of all. The Habsburgs didn't rule Europe for so long because they were invincible. They ruled because they endured. They survived the endless chaos of history only to be undone by the very mechanisms that had once secured their power: the strategic marriages, the focus on purity of bloodline, the resistance to change. Their lives, their suffering, and their incredible perseverance remain a timeless testament to the subtle, inexorable forces that shape human destiny. These are forces that no crown, no ceremony, no dynasty can ever fully escape. The empire faded into the mists of history. The family persisted, scattered across the continent. History, as it always does, moved on. But the Habsburgs, in all their flawed, brilliant, and human complexity, remain vividly alive in our collective memory, a story of endurance, fragility, and the quiet, unstoppable passage of time. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the past. See you next time.